Welcome to Spread the Light, where we use the power of our own stories of living with mental illness to dispel both stigma and stereotypes, and instead help spread hope and light. I'm your host, Dr. Devika Bhushan. I'm a pediatrician, a public health practitioner, an immigrant to the U.S. by way of the Philippines, from India originally. I'm a parent to a 2-year-old, and I'm also somebody who lives with bipolar disorder. Today, I'm welcoming an old friend to our show. Her name is Lara Burmeister. We first met about 20 years ago in college, and since then, she's spent much of her career working in roles to combat climate change. She is also a first-generation American and a person who lives with depression. Welcome to this show, Lara, and thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's launch in with our first question that we always start with, which is, how did your mental health journey begin?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would have to say, I think this might resonate to those who have dealt with depression, but when you have depression, you may not identify an episode when it's happening to you. And so when I really came to face it was about 7 years ago, when I went through a moment in my life where a really important relationship ended, and I fell into quite a deep cycle of depression. And in that process of recovery, I came to recognize earlier periods in my life where I'd had depressive episodes. And so the first period was actually in college. That also had to do with the end of a relationship that caused me to feel a lot of sadness and depth. And then again, actually, when I was in grad school, I had another episode which really had to do with a shift in facing my sense of identity. And so I was in a business school and someone who had spent most of my early career focused on climate change and trying to sort of reconcile the identity I wanted to build there. And I just remember sitting in these lectures and having these kind of unusual thoughts about being worried about homelessness, that like I could end up being homeless, and these conversations that were about how you might face your career or what you might do in a prestigious setting, and finding this sort of strange thought cycle as it pertained to the fears that were generated. So those were sort of these smaller incidences that, looking back, I could see the depressive signals. But really the first time I faced it and got help for it was about 7 years ago. And I'm happy to talk more about that.
Yeah, it's interesting because oftentimes when we first experience mental illness symptoms, it takes us a while to recognize what's going on and that there is, help to be had to get better.
Yes.
And, even the two of us, right, we were close in college and we, stayed close through the other parts of our lives. But it was only recently, probably 2 years ago or so, that we each opened up about our own mental illness histories with each other. And that not only enriched our friendship, but also helped normalize that experience even further for both of us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think those are both so true. That one, I think it takes multiple experiences with a mental illness to really get to a place where you can start recognizing it, or where you seek help such that you can identify it. But the stigma, I think for me personally, I have chosen, since recovering from a very deep spell of depression, I still manage it. I still have smaller periods, but 7 years ago, it was so deep that it took me 2 years to get from my kind of pre-depressive state back to a state that I felt reflected who I am as an individual. Like, it was that long, and that's like a very typical attribute of depression, that it's a slippery slope in, and it's a very difficult climb out.
Yeah.
And it has sort of that stasis. And so I think that post that period, I have opted to be very open with others about that, just in recognition that even the closest of friends may not share their true mental health journeys because of the vulnerability it creates, or just the not knowing how someone may respond.
Right. Absolutely. And when you're thinking about that 2-year period of time where you were far from yourself, and maybe there's another part of your journey that was even harder in some ways, but looking back at that really hard segment, knowing everything that you know today, what would you want to tell your former self?
Yeah, I think that the key thing that helps me today is knowing that there's coping mechanisms, like knowing that there are tools to address both the depressive state when you're deep in it, and also tools to prevent you from coming into that state. And I think that the hardest part about your first episode, when it is deep and you can't just sort of swim your way out of it through your own devices, is that you just don't have any of those tools.
Right.
And so when it comes to my first episode 7 years ago, that was like really quite deep, and I didn't have the tools on my own. I probably only became aware of the tools I needed 3 months into it. And, my deepest, darkest moment of that was I had come to this place where I was so depressed, and I stopped being able to eat, and I stopped sleeping. And then I stopped feeling like I could do work. And so, because I couldn't sleep and I couldn't eat, I ended up deciding to leave that role at that job because I just couldn't. I was like waking up with anxiety attacks and all sorts of things. And so I was in this moment, in this conversation with family members, where there was 7 people at a dinner table and I wasn't present. I was present with my own thoughts, but not engaging. And the thought I had was, well, I can try heroin now because it doesn't matter. And that moment was so, I like amazingly had the ability to recognize, like, wow, for someone who always cared about my intellectual capacity or being driven or being these things, to think like it's worth nothing. Like my life is not worth it. And that was a hard place to get to. And it took me months more to be able to come out of it because of the lack of tools. I just was surviving without them. It was this sort of slow cycle over 2 months, needing to self-sustain till I had therapy and was able to get prescribed medication. And amazingly, I was able to get like a great therapist who like saved my life for sure. The truth is, depression is interesting because if you look at my life, people have a tendency to say it's situational, and I'm a little concerned that I've framed it situationally, right? Like an incident happened and it led to this, right? Like that's the framing, and it's easy to see it that way, but it actually took learning about cognitive behavioral therapy that made me realize it's not actually the incident. The incident represents the underlying core belief of what you are coming to believe about the incident itself. Right. And so through cognitive behavioral therapy, it's really about the identification of what is your core belief that is driving your dissatisfaction. And in my case, if others are to hear this interview who know me but don't know me very well, I think they would be surprised to hear this about me, that I struggle. Because I was always the person who showed up prepared, showed up in an assertive way, seemed together, right? Seems like they, have no problems performing. And it's because my internal belief was one very much of the achiever mindset. Like, I need to be productive to be worthy, right? If only I achieve this, if I get that A, if I go to that school, if I achieve this, I'm good enough. And it took years of work to recognize that internal driver that was the force of my success was simultaneously the root of my unhappiness.
Right.
And just understanding that the core belief you hold drives how you respond emotionally to circumstances. So you wake up in the morning and you're unproductive, and therefore you feel sorry or bad about yourself, right? Because the core belief is, I'm only good enough if I achieve today. And so for me, it took me years to recognize that it wasn't the relationship itself, right? It wasn't my ex Manel. It was that he represented one of the only things I couldn't achieve. So I had spent, years going to some of the top schools, studying all the time, being just a very hardworking individual. And obviously relationships don't function under that premise. But it was the first attempt I had that I couldn't work hard enough to manifest something I wanted. And then I wasn't enough as a result of that. But it's that work of recognizing, like, what is the core belief that is driving your feeling. And so that's one tool I think was like tremendously valuable. But I would say cognitive behavioral therapy, I think, is a tremendous tool when it's done well. And I'll admit that I've seen many therapists who claim to do it and they don't. And it took me actually taking a class on the fundamentals of cognitive behavioral therapy to be able to apply it to myself. And, the premise being that you identify, they have strict terminology for this, which I'm sort of forgetting, but you identify the high level thought, right? Which is, I feel bad about myself, right? And then you ask why. Well, I feel bad because I didn't get enough done today. And it's like, why? And if you keep asking why, you get to the root belief. Right. And the root belief is either a negatively kind of structured belief, or it is a positively structured belief. So a negative one, as the one that mine was, you're only worthy if you're productive, needed to change to, you are enough.
Yeah.
As you are.
You are enough, regardless of what you do or do not do in a given day, in your life.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
And people who work through the world with beliefs like, it's okay to make a mistake, right? That's a great core belief. Or I just have to do my best. My process was to get rid of the core belief that was leading to so much of a sense of unworthiness, and to shift to one that says, I needn't be anything to anyone. I just can be. I can just be satisfied with the experience.
Right. Pick up on a couple of the really important things that you've just said. One of them is that oftentimes the tools and the inputs that we need, and in your case, it was cognitive behavioral therapy, but you learned it through a class instead of, where we think of normally getting some of these tools, which is through a therapist or a mental health provider. And because there's this element of hit or miss, right? With one, can we even access a therapist? Two, can we access a therapist who has the tool bag that we need at the time that we need it? Yeah. And three, is that an effective sort of alliance and relationship? And most of those conditions are usually not met. And I'll tell you my own experience too. I have been with therapists throughout my whole mental health journey, so now about 14 years. And my core beliefs are very similar to yours. And, I think this is one of those things that a lot of us as women particularly do share. And I'll show you, actually, I've got a book here. It's parallel to your class, and it's the CBT. Can we see this? Yes. Yeah. The CBT workbook for perfection.
Exactly.
And again, I did not find these tools and strategies through therapy. I found them, it was recommended to me actually by a therapist, this book. So in that sense, it was.
Mine as well. My course was recommended as well through therapy.
There you go. But it's so fascinating because we can share out the things that have helped us most. And for so many of us, it's outside of the normal healing sphere where we're supposed to get these tools and strategies.
Yes.
Yeah. And I want to ask you a little bit more about what is in your tool bag today. So there's two kinds of tool bags, right? There's the tools that keep you well, stable, healthy, whole throughout your kind of well life, right? When you're doing well and doing fine. And then there's the tools that you need to put into place when you feel yourself slipping in any given way. And so I'd love to hear more about both of those toolkits.
Yeah, absolutely. When I was in the early stage of that depression, where I was just sort of trying to swim with no ability to do so, I'm a very intellectual, rational thinker, right? And so I started just looking online for books because I was insured through a company where it took them, even after that point that I described of feeling like, well, why don't I just take heroin since it doesn't matter anymore? And I'm not a drug user. I had always thought of heroin as a choice that you would lose everything. And why would anyone make that choice? And so for me personally, that conclusion was so poignant because it was like, I'm ready to let go of everything.
It was your moment of passive suicidal ideation, essentially, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. But it took 2 months from that moment to actually get an appointment. And I should have, looking back, I would have suggested for myself to go seek a out of network therapist. But at the time, I just went through my insurance. She's a wonderful therapist and I still see her. But one of the things I did do is I started just like Googling books on depression, right? And I read a book that I would recommend to anyone who is dealing with depression called The Upward Spiral. It's 3 sections. It's the first, your neurochemistry, right? What are the parts of your brain and what do they do? The second part addresses how your brain goes into a depressive cycle, right? Like what are the neuropathways that you're re-triggering and reinforcing? And then the third section of the book is how you actually can use all of these non-medicated means by which you can get out of depression, whether it's the daily gratitude practice, exercise, speaking with friends, all of those types of tools. And for me, that book was tremendously valuable because it allowed me to to separate my sense of I am a problem. Like there's something wrong with me to my brain is not working. Like my brain is doing something that it's not supposed to do. And I need to redirect the course of those neural pathways. And that's the thing that I think is so important about depression, is to recognize that the cyclical thinking of I'm not good enough, or no one cares about me, or whatever it is that triggers it, the more your brain thinks about it, the more it reinforces the pathway, the faster it will go to that thought. And so you're carving these pathways. And so it's an active process of recarving new pathways. And it's active work that has to happen, which is why things like a gratitude practice matter. And so for me, secondarily, the recognition that psychologically, when we read things, we can reinforce an idea through reading, right? It's sort of like if you say something out loud, you'll start coming to believe that. So I use a lot of mantras, right? That's one of those tools of remember the mantra and say the mantra.
What are some of the words?
I've had different ones over the years, but like in that initial episode, it was nobody's watching your movie, which is a really strange mantra, but it came from this self-judgment place of being so concerned that people would look at my choices. Like I went to this great school and I did this cool thing, and then I went to these other good schools, and then I just dropped my career, right? I just literally left my job and like started running a bar, and I was so worried about the judgment, and it was the judgment I felt about myself in that moment. And so nobody's watching your movie was just like, why are you living in this world as which you're like the character of some movie that everybody's watching? Like nobody's paying any attention. There's freedom in relinquishing that sense that you are the center of everyone, that somehow judging eyes are perceiving you. And the recognition that like the friends who care are not the ones who are judging you.
Yeah, I love that.
At that time was very important because I was judging myself.
Yeah.
Very actively for what I saw as a lack of capacity, which when you're a productive oriented person is a very harsh judgment, right? To not be able to be capable. So some of my mantras, actually the great turn of phrase that my therapist has assisted me with, which is good for people who struggle with perfectionism, is converting your rigid thinking to your flexible thinking, right? So a rigid thought is one that's like, I should be this, or I must be that, right? I must know how to do this. I must be this person to this other person. Like I must be a great parent. I must turn this in on time. These very kind of harsh structures that you say to yourself internally. And flexible thinking is the process of shifting that to, I would prefer, but I can tolerate. I would prefer that I could get this in tonight on time, but I can tolerate that I can't. I would prefer that I knew how to do this. I would prefer that it was performing excellently. I would prefer that our relationship was this, but I can tolerate. And that kind of positive thinking of what you're capable of while relinquishing the demand is a really, really great way of combating those kind of cyclical thoughts.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I love the realism there, right? In the way that we shift our rigid thinking into more cognitive flexibility, emotional flexibility, and more just grounded in what we are capable of at that moment, rather than this perfect ideal that we're constantly striving for that's just not attainable.
Not attainable. Yeah, and we put all this pressure on who we need to be, and it's the root just of general unhappiness beyond, depression, just feeling dissatisfied. Actually, Mark Maron's podcast was super helpful to me. Just having someone so vulnerable and willing. I mean, it's not about mental health, but he's very open about his fight with anxiety, his issues with addiction, and in some of my lowest moments, he was a friend to me. So I hope that can be for someone else. Those are just some tools. I'm actually a strong proponent of medication. During that time and off, I take an SSRI, and that's very helpful. When you recognize this is a neurological situation and you've started forming these pathways, that medication can be extremely effective in sort of rerouting and preventing some of the really negative thoughts, or not letting those thoughts make you experience such an emotional depth from them. You still have the thoughts, but you don't have the emotional sort of devastation that they result in.
Absolutely.
When you ask, how do I maintain? I would say that I'm very aware of my triggers, or I'm aware of the signals where I can see that I might be heading into something. So whether it's not sleeping as well, or getting upset or caught on an idea that's circling, or not wanting to wake up and get up in the morning when my alarm clock goes off. I see those. And so I'm just more paying attention, right? Paying attention to the start. And I think in depression, it's incredibly important to keep kind of an eye or attention to how are you doing internally? Because being able to shift that thought early is the difference between having a depressive period of a couple weeks up to 6 months to 2 years. And for me, the goal is to not let it transcend into a long period.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what do you do differently when you notice your alarm clock going off and not wanting to wake up, or any of these other signs?
Yeah.
What is it that you canvas in that moment?
So that book, The Upward Spiral, I follow kind of most of the guidance there, right? Which is exercising is tremendously important. Meditating is very helpful. Speaking to friends when you don't want to speak to them, right? Kind of actively, when you feel like you don't want to speak to someone, force yourself to pick up the phone and have that call. The gratitude practice, I started doing a lot of yoga, and that's still a practice that I do as a preventative, and it's helpful in having mindfulness and enjoying my life. And actually, one other tool I used in the depths, like this is pre-medication, but just me trying to come up with my own ways of coping, was that I had this premise. I quit my job. I was not working. I was really struggling. And I said, okay, any good day, I just need to do 2 out of these 4 things. And if I can just do 2 of these, that's good enough. And those were exercise was the first one. Mm-hmm. Do something nice for myself. Do something nice for somebody else. Mm-hmm. And do something, quote unquote, productive. Mm-hmm. But productive meant like shipping a letter, right? The minimum. And I would live these days just tallying those things. But that framework allowed me to just like deconstruct it to the basics, where I say, okay, what did I do? Like, I just need to take a walk, or I just need to say something nice to someone else, or to myself. And 2 is enough. And 3 is fantastic. And 4 knocks it out of the park. Right. But it's these reframings of like, what is enough? That are the things that now I feel like I'm a very contented person because I'm not seeking things that don't matter.
Right. Yeah. And, when you're feeling at your worst, it can be so difficult to give yourself the just to get up the gumption to do even a small thing that matters and puts you on the path to feeling better. And so for you to give yourself this like incredible framework of a checklist of 4 things, and it can just be something small, like I said something nice to myself. Like it's such an empowering self toolkit to,
Exactly. To lower what good is, to give yourself permission and to create a framework that allowed me to feel okay
yeah,
while I had no structure and no sort of routine or sense of self,
yeah.
to just limit it to this sort of simple framing. Those are the things that I tap into. When those aren't enough, I will remedicate. So I will go back and reach out to my psychiatrist and get back on a medication.
So important. Thank you for sharing what's in that toolkit for you, that red flag toolkit. And to know that there's different layers of it, right? Like you might escalate on the exercise, on the friends,
Yeah.
on the yoga. And if when that's not enough, there's another tool in your toolkit and you go to medications as you need them.
Exactly. Like I said, very pro medication. That book enabled me to not feel a personal sense that somehow because my brain wasn't functioning correctly, that it was me. And I think that's the challenge with mental illness is we have such this conflation between your brain and your identity. And somehow we treat it as if it's this totally taboo or problematic attribute when it's just like anyone else having a thyroid problem and taking medication for that. I really do tell people like, hey, you should be investigating how to correct your neurochemistry. And there's nothing wrong with needing a medication to do that. I think the challenge for many people is just the ramp up period can feel uncomfortable. It often takes people 2 months before they feel anything. And you
Mm,
might be suffering in that period. And side effects can be difficult depending on what you're on. So just that process of calibrating is a commitment.
right. And waiting for the benefits to really settle in, exactly as you're saying, in this ramp up period where you're dealing mostly with potential side effects, right? And a lot of people in that period of time will lose heart and not stay the course. Or, and this happens a lot, you're on the wrong medication for your brain at that moment. And that process of really settling into the right one and finding that trial and error fit can be really disheartening and frustrating as people are struggling.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You've already done a couple, but what is one myth about the mental health space that you'd like to settle the score on?
I think that there is a perception that only some people deal with this, right? That it's only under certain circumstances or with certain kind of conditions that are genetic or like that it's limited. And I would argue that mental health is pretty pervasive. And when you shared your experience with me, I was so surprised to hear it.
Mm,
Because when I thought about you as a friend in my life, I would say, Devika's one of the most solid, grounded, consistent, people that I've ever met. And it's just not an association that's typically given to a bipolar diagnosis. And
yeah.
I think similar to me, when I am going through depression, like I am able to create a tough face, right? Like, and when I left my corporate job, I felt as though I was like leaving with a dark mark or my tail was between my legs and that my raw experience was like out there for everyone to see.
Mm,
And recently coming back into this kind of space of the energy field, I've reached out to friends who I hadn't shared at that time what I was experiencing. And they were like, wow, we had no idea what
mm,
you were dealing with. Like you just seemed so together.
mm.
And I just think there has to be more empathy and recognition that so many people are dealing with periods of depression. Anxiety is very prevalent, whether it's bipolar disorder or other things. there's just a huge percentage of the population, and we need to stop treating it like it's a subset of the population when it's actually just based on your neuroplasticity, actually kind of this thing in flux for most people, right?
Right.
That you're managing. And that's where I think there's just this bifurcation of those who deal with mental illness and those who don't. And I don't think that that's true.
Mm. Yeah, I love that. You really can't tell from the outside who might be struggling with a mental health condition and who might not be, because the truth is that it might take all of your energy and all of your willpower to present a face of neutrality or I have it all together, even when you are at the lowest depths of a depression or a different kind of a mental health experience. And because these can be invisible, and again, they can strike anybody. There's not like one kind of person or personality type that ends up having a certain kind of a disorder. It's almost, you know, I just saw a
Yeah.
study come out that said that more than half of the population will be diagnosed with a mental health condition or will suffer from a mental health condition at some point in their lifetime by the time they turn 75. That's the
Yeah.
majority of humanity. And so if it's not us, it's our brothers and sisters, it's our parents, it's our kids, it's our, neighbors and friends. And it's one of these things like no one wants to look different. And so we do a really good job of zipping it up and acting like
Right. Of hiding.
it's happening.
Of
But
hiding.
it
Right.
takes everything out of you. Literally, like, you know this, right? When you're depressed, you put up that face and then you collapse the second
Yeah.
you're on your own because you're like, oh,
Yeah.
I don't have to
Yeah.
put
Like you
all
walk out of the office door
pretending.
and then there's just like tears streaming, and then there's just this holding together and this letting go. Absolutely. And during the period of depression, I was very protective, right? I felt tremendous sense of vulnerability, like the fear that like, what if I give this information to someone and they don't hold it for me?
Mm,
Right? Like you confide in a friend and they're not there in the way you need, right? The
mm,
comments like, why can't you just cut it together? Or, the wanting to be helpful, but not recognizing that this is not a just snap out of it
yeah,
situation. Someone not receiving you in the way that you need because it's such a painful experience when you're in that vulnerable space. And so now that I'm not there, it's arguably of all the things I care about in my life, being a person who can be vulnerable and share and hold space is
mm,
the most important thing to me
yeah,
because people need that. They need someone who says, like, I'm here, I can hold it. And it's okay.
yeah. And you are not alone, you know?
If you're not alone and it's not your fault.
Yeah,
Hey,
yeah.
like,
And you will be better. And
and you
there's,
will get better. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm so proud of you for being in that place and for having that as part of your mission.
Yeah. I'm very forthcoming with people about my experience, and I try to, I don't know, I think your next question is probably going to get there. So I don't want to preempt it.
Yeah, I love everything about what we just talked through, and just so blessed and privileged to have somebody like you and you specifically in my life. And
Likewise.
thank you for being the person that you are. And I think probably this is the next question you were alluding to, but I'd love to hear about how you think about your mental health journey as having driven some of your unique assets or even superpowers.
Yeah, exactly. I was reflecting on this a bit. And, when I think about myself when we met, like before all of this, I think I was probably described as like just being extremely confident, right? Just walking into a room and having sort of an assertive energy and like, I'm going to get this done. And I was sort of described as like, oh, she's intimidating, right? And even in graduate school, like that was sort of a reputation I had just because I have sort of that German, first generation intensity of
Yeah.
just being direct. So that combination sort of leads to a certain assertive energy. But, I just didn't really have that capacity for recognizing when others weren't okay. And I didn't have the empathy, right? Like I it didn't make sense to me. It's like, just get it done. That was my mindset. And I think through that experience of really hitting rock bottom, like in a way in which, I described that I felt like I was standing on one side of a mirror and I could see my former self on the other, and I wasn't there, right? Like that type of disassociation. And like in that depth, for instance, I couldn't say about myself, I couldn't say I'm kind and I'm competent. Like I couldn't manifest those words. And that was so distant from my true self, like from my healthy self. But when I came out of it, now my priority is very much about ensuring others are okay. Mm-hmm. So if I'm working with people, I'm paying attention to the signals of, oh, they look, tired this morning, or they don't look okay, right? And then taking the time when I'm in a leadership position to make that space. Because when I was dealing with mine, like my crisis, I did not feel that my boss at that time could make space for me, that there was space to be honest that I was struggling with something that really I should have taken 2 months of help, like mental health leave, but I just didn't have a counterparty that I could trust with that. And so as I think about myself, like in the workforce and in my day to day, like I care so much about what is the temperature of the room and how are other people reacting, and not overanalyze, like, not reading into things. Yeah. But when you recognize something is off, that you create the space that someone feels safe to share, right. And so to inquire, like, hey, you seem a little different today. Like, is everything okay? In the private setting. And so I think my priorities have shifted greatly in how I think about what it means to be a good colleague and being a good person to others. It's really about creating that space that I just frankly didn't when I was younger. I wasn't aware of it in the way that I am now.
That's so powerful. Because you are one of the most warm and empathic people. And it's really interesting as you look back on your journey to think about kind of the pre-depressed Lara maybe didn't have those same cues and understanding of what different could look like or what a struggle could look like. And now that you walk through that, you're so attuned to these cues and needs of people around you because you didn't have that, right? As you were in the hardest place of your life, you were in a circumstance where people were not empathically tuned into what you wanted, what you needed. And now to be that person, I mean, that's just such a powerful shift to go through.
Yeah. And I think like the other thing that I think I'm so much more capable of now is true gratitude in the present, and that any day that I wake up just in contentment, like not even happiness, but just at ease, is a day that I cherish.
Yeah.
Because in all those days that you wake up and it's not, you're suffering. And so to be able to just be so appreciative of like, I'm just so glad I'm in a phase where I wake up and I'm happy, or not even happy, just at peace, to be at peace and to value that,
Yeah.
And I think depression is very complex. And again, I think it shouldn't be limited to a sense that it's situational. For me, it was an unbuilding of an identity and a rebuilding of a new one. And again, it's those beliefs you have of what you need to be to yourself and to others that can create the context for a depressive mind, right? To feel like you are not enough, to feel you are not achieving. And so I had to sort of deconstruct all of myself to be able to reconstruct it in a way that had a healthy framing. And, it's very like in line with Buddhist thinking, but just not feeling like my ego matters so much, and more, how do I treat others?
Right. So you've been talking about this really poignant phrase you used about breaking yourself down and then rebuilding yourself anew. How long did that process take you?
I think it's a continual process, but I think when I, was in my deepest depressive state, it took me 2 years to go from the initial sort of bottom to a sense of my normal self, in the sense that like I wasn't feeling a tremendous amount of shame, or I wasn't, actively in a depressive state. And then I think it took me probably 2 more years to like really uncover, like, because some of it's just coping, right? You're just coping. You're so actively in your brain just trying to get through it. And then I was able to transcend it and figure out like, okay, let me uncover more and more, right? And so it took me 2 years to go from feeling the shame of this fall, right? From my perspective, no one else's, but that I had kind of fallen from some sort of path of career performance and just took myself off a ledge, to get okay with that and to forgive myself. That took 2 years. And then it took 2 more years of thinking like, okay, now that I'm okay, how do I rebuild every brick so that my foundation is not based on something that's so precarious, right? How do I avoid this very negative thing? And, your core beliefs often stem from your nuclear family, right? And it's not a reflection that somehow you have a problematic family, but as I've relayed, I'm a first generation German American. Both of my parents are German. And culturally, being productive, right, being useful is a part of that culture, right? And so when I started talking to my mom about this identity and this idea, like, oh, I have this core belief that I have to be useful, right? I have to be useful. And she opened up that she has that core belief, right? And it makes sense, right? And I grew up in a family that was kind of like, if you're going to do it, do your best, right? Or if, like if you want to do it right, you got to do it yourself. Like just things that are more like, be perfect, do it the right way.
Yeah.
And I think I had to really let go of those and build my own. And I think once you start building your own, you're able to free yourself of the expectations of the others. And so, for me, that building is like a continual process of adjustment. Like I'll fall into old patterns of wanting to achieve X or Y or wanting to be seen a certain way. But I think that my core now is like, if you think about what you want people to say in their eulogy about you, like, I don't care that anyone thinks I'm smart, that I did XYZ. I just want people to say she was kind.
Yeah.
That's it. And if that's all I need, then all I need to do is walk through life trying to be kind.
Right.
And that is a much healthier version of what I want to work towards. And it reframes a lot for me in how I interact with people and how much urgency is necessary in any given moment.
Yeah.
I try to just be kind, but it's a long process.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing all of that with us. It's not easy to do such deep and intensive work to rebuild yourself to a place where you feel more stable and whole and kinder and can focus on the things that have importance because they match with your values rather than sort of the shoulds that you think
Right.
Other
Right.
people.
The external sort of version of what you've been led to believe or that you've held on to, right? And, my parents never said you have to be perfect. But that, when you were in some of these schools as well, there is this pressure to perform, right? Like there's a reason there's an A and there's an F. And there's a reason why we celebrate those who get A's. And when you live in that system, you get this really combined view. It's so common. And I think that that's, as I was saying, I think everyone deals with mental health.
Yeah.
Many of my friends who are quote unquote high achieving struggle with mental health because of that internal narrative of like, I need to achieve X in order to be okay.
Right.
And the truth is, none of us need to achieve X to be okay.
Yeah, agreed. Final question for you. What do you hope for us collectively for the future?
Ooh, that's a big question for someone who works in climate change.
I know.
Attempting to combat climate change. I'm assuming you mean more in the mental health context or just
we
globally?
Can talk about any aspect of the collective future that you're wanting to lean into.
I so much hope that we can be in a society where there's space for people to find their sense of contentment, right? That we collectively create space. And I think, in the long course of history, I do see a line of progress, right? But I wish so much that people could live in their true version of themselves, of what their values are, and then they can move through life with those values rather than feeling like they need to subscribe or like fit in within some other person's view or some societal view and constraint. And so that's what I think I would hope for collectively.
I love that so much. Thank you so much for being here with us, for sharing your story, and for just being an inspiration and spreading the light.
Thank you. This is really wonderful. And I hope that these words help someone. Thank you for having me.
Of course.